It's like, it's boring, isn't it? It's boring.
I said I'm gonna keep it a secret from the listeners this week, but my beverage of choice is a Pacific Pilsner. It comes from Hawaii. It's called Mucho Aloha, which is a really lame name, but it's a great can and a great beer.
Okay, welcome everyone to episode 29 of Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast. We hope you're all well. Thanks for still listening, if you're still there. And James, are you still there?
Barely, but getting by, man, getting by. Not the easiest of weeks here in the Tokyo metropolitan area. What's going on in lovely Ireland?
Not much. I'd say bit of the same old. Autumn's begun. Everything else I can't be bothered talking about anymore, to be honest. I'm so sick of it all. So why don't we just crack on today?
I think that's a fine way to introduce the show. Let's do it.
Well, we've called this episode Closed for Business, and I suppose it's pretty obvious why. Over the last, well, it's months now, isn't it? Because we started back in April with the podcast. But I think, we've touched several times and actually covered one or two of these places in more detail. And I suppose in many ways, one of the reasons for beginning the project in the first place was really for me as a photographer, certainly was to create this kind of document of these places that are increasingly under threat from a variety of reasons, and, preserve them for posterity. And that's what we've managed to do. And we've covered already, I think, Jazz Room Stick in Shinjuku. We talked at length about the incredible Jazz Pepe, which of course had opened in 1967 and closed a couple of years ago. Luckily, we were able to get to it before it did. And then we also mentioned the mysterious cabin in our Yokosuka episode where we were tempted and taunted by the most delicious lunch in town, but unfortunately, we never got past the shutter when we were down there that day, and we're not sure still to this day if indeed it was just closed or it is closed for good. We suspect perhaps that it has now gone, but we're going to cover a few different places on today's episode that we've been to together. I think all of them, but unfortunately now all of them have in fact, since we photographed them and visited them, closed, which I suppose in some ways, not to be too sentimental, is part of life. I mean, it's part of urban redevelopment, it's part of gentrification and all these things that we experience living in the city. But I suppose it doesn't make it any less sad that they've gone, does it?
No, not at all. And, especially because that it's an environment that's so hard to replicate. The great jazz kisaten that we have gone on at length about, and the things that we love about them is that sort of lived in feel, when you're going in there, you're feeling a place that the owner and the regular customers have been in for, 20 to 30 years, sometimes 40, sometimes even 50 years. And when that's gone, even if it reopens, sometimes you can't recapture that feeling. And so, as not just a jazz fan, but as somebody that's living in Japan for pretty much my entire adult life, seeing that cycle and seeing these places slowly close down is certainly a sad and sort of melancholic thing to think about.
Well, that's brought me right down. God, how depressing. Can we bring it up from here? I don't know. I mean, the very nature of the episode, I suppose it is a little bit sad, isn't it? I mean, on a positive note, I suppose there are many, many more hundreds of places that are still going. And as we've said in a few episodes recently as well, some that are really thriving. And we did get a really nice surprise over the last few weeks, which hopefully we're going to finish with today at the end of the episode. But let's start with the wonderfully named Fat Mama.
Classic joint. What a great name as well, named after the Herbie Hancock tune. Philip, I don't know if you remember when we went to Fat Mama. I think I had been there once or twice before, but the owner there, it was only open for 5 years, and I think we've talked about other places that are built sort of as an extension of the owner's house. So they'll sort of do a bit of renewal of the first floor and make it into a cafe. So that's what Fat Mama was. And I remember talking with him and him saying how, he'd always dreamed of opening his own place. A classic story about the guy that retires and finally has time to do it. And yet after only 5 years, he announced that he was closing. And I, was sort of delicately asked if it was a money thing, were they just not making enough money? And he said, no, they were making enough money, but it was just that long term, he didn't think it was going to be viable in the next 10 to 15 years. And so he emptied the place out and turned it into a kind of a community space rec center for local neighborhood senior citizens. And I think, we've discussed, especially on our talks going up north and our visits to the regions of Japan, how the demographics of this country are very, very unusual. I think it's about right now 30% of the population are above the age of 65, and that's projected to go above 50% within the next 30 to 40 years. So that's a society that has never been seen in the world before, completely skewed towards people above the age of 65. And, you can even see that in my neighborhood here in Yokohama. This is just a small, regular neighborhood, and we have 8 pharmacies, 5 rehabilitation clinics, and 4 retirement homes in one neighborhood. There's one toy store. That tells you kind of all you need to know about the population issue of Japan. And so
it's probably worth pointing out, though, that 4 of those 8 pharmacies are to deal with your various ailments, isn't it?
I suspect a comment coming up about my visits to the jazz bathrooms. Is that what that's implying there?
I don't think anyone needs any more detail on that.
I think good friends are familiar with that story. But as we said, back to Fat Mama, the owner. Anyway, he realized that just in his particular neighborhood, they needed, there wasn't really a close by sort of community center. There are a lot of those around Japan. And when talking with his friends and neighbors, they decided that would be a better use of the space than having it as a jazz cafe. So, you can imagine that we've not heard that story before, although he said he was going to keep a couple hundred records in there. So,
oh, wow. What a compromise.
Yeah.
It's pretty forward thinking, I suppose, and quite selfless, particularly if you've opened up this business. Talking about it not being viable, 10, 15 years, a long time, as we've learned this year, certainly. But, I suppose the area that it's in, it's not a particularly slightly off, not unfashionable, but certainly less fashionable neighborhood in Tokyo. So you don't imagine perhaps that the rents were particularly high, and you can see from the exterior shot as well. It's got a little. What is that? A stamp shop? Is it like a Hanko shop? Just on the left-hand side of it.
I think that's what. Yes, a Hanko shop.
Yeah. So it's kind of been particularly high overheads as well. And I think from the photograph of him that we took, that's his son on the right, isn't it?
Yes. It was his family tended to help out most of the time there.
Yeah, so then you kind of expect, I suppose, that it would have kept going a little bit longer. But again, obviously, if there's a need for that sort of space in the community and that's the best way to use it, then fair play that he made that decision. I suppose from a selfish point of view, it's a shame maybe that they couldn't have come up with some sort of hybrid senior citizen jazz kisa, because let's face it, the majority of customers, with the exception of ourselves and a few other notables, generally tend to be in that sort of age bracket anyway, don't they?
Well, yeah, and I wonder exactly, if I'm ever near, it's not too far away from Meguro Station, which is pretty central, so I could try to stop by, because I don't know what exactly the plan for the rec center was going to be, and how different would it really be to the cafe right now, where most of the customers were his age, and it is just a shame. Look how lovingly he put the records together in that cabinet, It's
beautiful,
And you just think we know that, as I said, the demographics are changing. There's a need for these kinds of spaces, but there's also a need for the jazz spots too. So, what's he going to do with all those records and all the photos? You got the Bill Evans portrait up there on the top right, which is lovely. Is he just going to keep that in his house? Yeah, definitely a real shame. I loved that spot, actually, Fat Mama.
When you look at the photograph of the sound system, or at least the speakers, certainly, that has this TV positioned in between them, you can see actually quite old furniture. But not only that, how intense an experience would it be sitting right in those front seats that we can see, again, as we've mentioned in previous places like Chigusa and others, where they're very clearly positioned to face towards the speakers. I'd say if you're down in that front row, it's got to be a pretty intense experience, senior citizens or not.
Yeah, for sure. Although maybe they're a bit hard of hearing, so maybe it wouldn't be so bad.
That could be the reason for the proximity, you see. We're picking it all apart. But yeah, Fat Mama was a nice place. I think we went, well, you can tell from the exterior shot, we definitely went during the daytime, which is not uncommon, I suppose, for some of the places that we've been to. But I remember it being a really nice place. We had a coffee there, had a chat with him, really friendly vibe. And you can tell even just from the slightly bemused look when we asked them to take their photograph of the kind of people they are. Very friendly, very approachable. And yeah, like you say, a bit of a shame that it's gone, but in some ways nice that it's kind of metamorphosized into this community space. And obviously, hopefully, a lot of other people are getting some good use out of it for reasons other than perhaps just sitting listening to obscure jazz records.
Well, I have to say, I'm a lot. Even though I was sad to see it close, I was a lot more accepting of it for the reason of opening a neighborhood community center. Than the reason we have for our next joint, why this was torn down, because I'll try to refrain from busting out to a lot of profanity as we talk about Mary Jane, which is a place that, was very, very important cafe right next to Shibuya Station, on the south side of Shibuya Station, which is not the direction that most people who visit Tokyo when they go to the famous Scramble or the Center-gai area. That's on the west side. The south side was a little bit sleepier. But Philip, you surely remember as you came off the intersection with the stairway, the pedestrian stair passageway. What do you call that thing?
A bridge? Pedestrian bridge?
Pedestrian bridge, yes.
There you go. Nailed it. You want to do that one again?
Yeah, that's our intro for this week then, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that I'm very familiar with because I spent a lot of my time in Shibuya, either there or passing through, and I lived in Shimokitazawa, so I was in and out of there. My work was there for many years too. So it's an area that I was very familiar with. And you're right, it's probably the area. There's a couple of big hotels on that side of the station, but it's maybe an area that people tend to go less to, or maybe it's a little bit more hipstery, as if you walk along the tracks, it leads into Daikanyama, which, sort of one of those ultra hip neighborhoods. But a lot of guitar shops around, I think, around that street as well. And
that's right. It was one of those streets that had about 3 or 4 different instrument stores. It had not only Mary Jane on the same block, but it had one of the oldest remaining standing bar izakayas down in the basement. This was a pretty well-known place. It had been open since the 50s. The kind of joint where it's 200 yen for a bottle of beer, and the floor hasn't been cleaned in the last 2 decades. But it had sort of a mixture of old regular customers, but younger people who sort of enjoyed that old style of very local. Yeah. It was run by a family. And so having the same street with these, these independent instrument shops, this beautiful old izakaya down in the basement, and then Mary Jane, a classical jazz kiseten, and it's all been torn down to build yet another skyscraper shopping development, which is now the 4th new one in the last 7 years to surround Shibuya Station. I mean, these are just the most hideous, disgusting tall buildings, full of shops that nobody needs. They're totally impossible to distinguish which one you're in. So when you go down into the station, it's completely confusing which building you're going to. Yet because of the power of the construction industry, number one, and the fact that the government officials in Tokyo and probably most of Japan really don't care about preserving older culture. So they're more than willing and powerful enough to just raise an entire city block and get rid of a place like Mary Jane that was, really important to a lot of people, both musicians and fans,
Yeah, I mean, I think... Yeah, I mean, we probably don't want to get too sidetracked, into the wider discussions of why that happens in Japan. But I totally agree with you. I mean, if you've been to Japan, or certainly if you were in Japan 10 or 15 years ago and you go back in the next couple of years and you pass through Shibuya, I'm fairly sure you won't recognize it. It's changed just inconceivably in the time certainly that I was there, and I know from going back after a couple of years being away, already there were even more changes, and I know they have a longer term project to transform that entire area. And I suppose places like Mary Jane inevitably are victims of this kind of development, this kind of gentrification. It's interesting just to contextualize it too, because we've certainly mentioned a few times, I think, about the idea that, in Japan, these places would be protected and so on and so forth. But actually, interestingly, last week in Dublin, there's a very famous house which belonged to I suppose, a politician or certainly a revolutionary leader who was involved in the 1916 Easter Rising called the O'Rahilly, and it had stood for many, many years on this site in a large park. And actually, the City Council in Dublin had moved to put it onto the Protected Building Register. And early in the morning on, I think, Monday or Tuesday this week, developers just moved in and bulldozed the whole house. So it made me realize that, nowhere really is safe, even if you have a culture where supposedly at least these kind of buildings are valued for their historical and cultural value. And, Japan really does not value the old. It's very much about the new. Probably the one exception is things like temples. But I think, again, we've mentioned this before, that, a lot of temples that you go into in Japan may seem very old and seem very authentic in inverted commas, but of course in many cases they've been burned down many times and often repainted or indeed rebuilt on the same site. So sometimes it's just that illusion of age, but it's a real tragedy that Mary Jane went. I know we were there twice. I went with you once, and then I also went a second time to meet a big supporter of the project, a guy called Jerome Schmidt.
Jerome, yes.
Yeah, who is a big supporter of Tokyo Jazz Joints, and perhaps one of the maddest Japanese, one of the maddest collections of Japanese records, music, books, and paraphernalia that I've ever come across. I've unfortunately only ever met him once. We are still in regular contact through social media, but interesting guy. And I always associate Mary Jane with him because I went to meet him and a colleague of his there one night. And I think that was the evening that actually I took these photographs, which again featured,
it's not the easiest place to photograph, actually, the way it was laid out. And if it was just a couple of customers, it was really hard to move with that shape of the room and the way the tables were. Yeah.
Yeah. It was hard to get really any sort of angle, I suppose. And again, interestingly, even if you look at the photograph there, you can see that the guy sitting on the right with his head in his hands, very much that has the look of a guy who's escaping the suffocating confines of an office job to me. And so again, perhaps not the sort of place you want to be capturing customers just in case the wrong person sees the photograph. So it's very much that kind of vibe, and very, very classic Tokyo Jazz Joints, rickety old staircase. You wouldn't want to be coming down there at night after a few drinks, I would say. But gone. And unfortunately, that's it for Mary Jane. I mean,
if you want to read, if any of the listeners out there, you want to read a little bit more about Mary Jane, and you can hear some testimonials from people who were regulars there. I wrote an article about it when it closed. You can just Google that. It's in the Japan Times newspaper. So just look up Mary Jane with my name. You should be able to find it. Got a good few quotes in there from people who'd been going there for 40 years. So you can imagine that they were extremely upset about it closing down.
You can also get that article if you go to the exhibitions page on tokyojazzjoints.com as well. All the places that we've been featured in the media and various exhibitions and publications are all linked to that page. So go and check it out there, and you should be able to find a link to it.
One other point about what you were saying about in Japan, I remember, and this definitely applies to the next place we're going to go to, which is your old hometown of Shimokitazawa. You might remember the great Donald Ritchie, who wrote about film, art, and basically all things Japan, a mentor to really a lot of us who wanted to settle in this country and learn how to approach living in a very different culture and society. Well, when Donald Ritchie was a couple years before he died, he was asked to sign a petition against the redevelopment of Shimokitazawa, the station front, which you're obviously very familiar with. And he actually declined to sign it. And a lot of the people who were involved were quite upset with him. You of all people, you've lived in Tokyo for 55 years, shouldn't you be the one to help us sort of protect these things? But he came back with a very interesting comment saying that, it's because I've lived in Tokyo for so long. I've seen so many changes. This is about the 7th version of Tokyo that I've seen, and there have been 70 more. So it's not a city like Paris or London or Moscow or Xi'an in China that will remain the same for 2,000 years. That's never been what Edo or Tokyo was, and so I don't really see the point in protesting it. So just I think
it's probably worth pointing out as well, James. I mean, it's very easy for it's that classic thing, I suppose, of going traveling and being disappointed that that you see a lot of what you recognize as your life in other cultures that you visit, and this idea that things should stay the same for our benefit. And I suppose as well, living in Japan, as we know, it's an earthquake culture as well. So everything that's built or anything that's created there, there's always this undercurrent of at any point it could all just disappear into literally into a hole in the ground. And so I suppose that there is that different approach to regeneration and even with things like houses, generally speaking, houses are built to last 20 to 30 years. Whereas, I'm currently sitting in a rented house in Dublin that was built, 120 years ago and probably will be here in another 120 years,
right.
Provided I don't wreck it, So it's, it is a different perspective. And I suppose sometimes, it's easy maybe to say, well, we want it to stay. We want this idealized or romanticized version of Japan, to remain as it was. I remember you talking once about this, having a discussion like this with your father-in-law about Showa era Japan. Do you remember telling me that story?
Yes, because there was one of these sort of retro, kind of standing bar type places with the little small dishes, a yakitori or whatever, a draft beer. And I said, hey, why don't we stop by that? That looks kind of nice. And he was like, why would anybody want to drink in a place like that? Every place was like that when I was growing up, and they were filthy and disgusting. It just reminds me of poverty and being in the post-war period where we had nothing. And I was just like, wow. Okay, yeah. So one person's nostalgia is another person's quite heavy memories. And so for someone like him, he used to say that, he very rarely liked to eat out anywhere in the neighborhood because he said, no, these places are all dirty. Like, the food there is bad quality, et cetera, et cetera. It reminded him of the old days, not interested in the least. And so he would probably think that, like, tearing down these streets was a really good thing because he's like, yes, it should be more modern, it should be cleaner.
Yeah, and of course you're keeping that family tradition of not eating the horrible food going, even into the 21st century.
That's only in the jazz joints. I'm a very, very strong supporter of my local yakitori shop.
So listen, you mentioned Shimokitazawa there, and we're going to finish up there today because it is a place, very, very, very special to me. And I spent a lot of my time both going out there and for the latter part of my time in Japan living there. But before we do that, we're going to nip to a couple of other places, which again, in keeping with the theme of today's episode, are also closed. Tom, what about Tom? Slightly mysterious place. I do remember, of course, going to it, and I do remember taking these photographs. But if I'm not mistaken, it was very early on in the project, I think.
I think it was extremely early. It might have been, maybe within the first month, most likely.
I think so, yeah.
Tom was in a neighborhood called Asagaya on the west side of Tokyo, which is well known for the Asagaya Jazz Street, which happens every October, actually, which is a whole weekend of indoor and outdoor gigs. And so Asagaya's got a whole bunch of little jazz joints. We talked about Misty there, I believe, on a previous
of course,
a previous episode. So yeah, Tom was a place that I actually used to go because I lived along that train line, and it was really interesting because as you can see, you captured the sign. That kanji is not the particularly easiest one to read, but it was sort of a pun on the owner's name, which I believe was Tomohiro, who loved basically the two things that I love most in this world, outside my family. I should probably add that. Jazz and baseball.
Oh, beer's not making the cut?
Jazz and baseball.
Thought Guinness would be in the top two. Can't believe it. Shocking. Going to have to go back and re-edit all the other episodes.
Jazz and baseball.
That's Sunday gone.
You look at the fourth photo and you can see what we're talking about. You see up on the left side above the albums are a whole bunch of signed baseballs that the owner there had, in addition to what had to have been at least 2,000 to 3,000 records.
Yeah.
And nothing to rail against about Tom closing. He just got old. He was old. He was unwell. I believe his daughter was there working and helping him out. once he became a little bit too infirm to run the place. But she basically said that she couldn't run the place by herself. She was just helping out, didn't really have any interest in running a jazz cafe. And so they closed the place down. I heard that they sold half of the record collection. Don't know what happened to the other half. Maybe it's still in his home. Would be a shame if they were just thrown into some dusty attic space. But yeah, Tom was one of those neighborhood spots. Again, we've talked so many times how, only in Japan can you be in a little outskirts neighborhood and there'll be a place like this.
Yeah, it was a gorgeous place. I think, it sticks out to me photographically for a couple of reasons. That very long painting, I'm not sure what the provenance of it is. I mean, it has the sort of look initially of a New Orleans style funeral, but then when you look at it a little bit more closely, it seems much more in line with kind of Black Panther era propaganda and sort of imagery as well. There's a lot of militance and sort of power in the expressions of the faces of the people in the painting, but something perhaps that we don't expect to see in the average Japanese jazz kisa as well. So that really stood out for me. We mentioned, again, without rehashing previous episodes, about generally speaking, the lack of political slogans and political materials that you find in these places, with the exception of maybe Samurai, of course. And, it tends to be all about the music and it tends to be about these musicians. And yet there's this fantastic painting on the wall with this old decrepit oil lamp hanging above it, which I just thought, for me, from photographing so many of these places, was a really unusual image. And I suppose then that links really nicely with Max Roach, the Max Roach album on display in the bar counter, which again, huge wide counter and just so beautifully laid out, and so much stuff on that counter, very neatly organized, not just the records, but like you say, the baseballs, the drinks, the snacks, and everything else.
I love the globe. I mean, I don't know again, why it's there. Unusual. It's taking up a lot of space, but you've got the globe, you've got the little the knight next to him with his shield.
Don't forget the sheep.
Yeah, and then he's in between some vodka bottles and Campari, and then your favorite, the snacks, which you always help yourself to.
Bring it in.
So yeah, it's the bric-a-brac, as you'd say, I guess, of the place. And look up top above, he's got the cow up there on the top, and what looks like some kind of scale. I don't know what that is next to the old radio.
Yeah, it's an old weighing scale, I think. And you can see even just behind that, there's an old kind of Showa era sign as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, a real repository of just like, decades and decades of collecting things as well. Right on the fridge too, if you zoom right in, you can see a little Doug coaster there just tucked in the fridge. And we haven't talked too much about Doug yet, but we will be coming back to it in a different episode. And I think that's a Blue Note coaster just next to it with a number. So again, if you go to the Blue Note in Tokyo, you'll often get a table number so that you can settle up your bill.
And we will be having a very special episode about Doug, but it's probably the matchbook / coaster that you see the most in other cafes.
Yep.
For reasons we will definitely get into. But I thought Tom was just gorgeous, and I love the fact that he would put the albums on, and some places we've joked about how the volume can be a little bit overwhelming, even when you're really digging it. I remember because Tom was one of those places that for some reason kept the volume very low. I had that in my notes. It's like the volume here is low.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that was just a nighttime thing. Maybe because it wanted people to have a chance to talk or whatever. But it was one of the things that stood out to me. The baseball came because he was actually a manager of a local team, like a community baseball team, and had played when he was in high school. So all of those balls go back probably to when he was playing in the late 50s. I mean, again, that's wonderful memorabilia. Yeah, just a fantastic place.
That was Tom, and I mean, we sort of started on quite a positive note, I suppose, and hopefully we'll end on one. But we're really down in the sort of the trough at the moment after the peaks of previous episodes, for sure. And the next place we're going to go to is a place that you referenced, I think, in last week's episode as well, because you were casting aspersions on my social etiquette, and also I think incriminating my wife and her need to go to the toilet into the whole story. But the next place we're going to go to, which is also sadly closed for business for good now, is Milestone. Tell us about Milestone, because I know it's a place that's quite close to your heart.
Oh, certainly. Milestone, I think, was the second jazz cafe I'd ever been to. It was in Takadana Baba, in between Takadana Baba Station and Waseda, which is where I went to school here. And it was so special because I remember walking in and not only was knocked out by those speakers, those gorgeous, gorgeous speakers that you've got a great portrait of, but the entire right wall is filled of books and magazines, which about 90% of which were about jazz. All Japanese, obviously, but at the time I was really, really diving into studying pretty much every day. So I would probably say I spent at least a good 30 to 40 days in total sitting in Milestone for a couple hours when I should have been in the library. Well,
you were sort of in a library, weren't you?
A different kind of library. Yeah, and it wasn't North Korean politics. It was jazz, Japanese jazz, and the history. And you can see, everything about the place with the plants on the table, that kind of tablecloth. It kind of stood out to me. It was a very different decor. Even the building, with the way those windows were, looked rather American.
Yeah, I remember like Japanese that place in my head. I remember that really sticking in my mind when I went to it. I thought, how it's such an unusual. I mean, we've seen these kind of buildings. Maybe if you were to see that maybe in parts of Yokohama or down Yokosuka, it wouldn't perhaps be so surprising. But it's not the kind of building that you expect to see, in central Tokyo. And that really stuck out to me of how unusual it looked. Like you say, it was sort of like that classic kind of like New England American style home that I was not expecting to find when you brought me to it the first time. Yeah.
And the owner, Orita-san, a very, very quiet guy, always used to be dressed in yukata, the Japanese sort of casual kimono robe. Didn't really chat much with me or with the customers, but was always, always pretty polite enough and definitely remembered people. It was the kind of place a lot of locals went to for, again, many, many years. And I think that he closed down, not for redevelopment, and he wasn't even particularly old. I think he just decided that it was just time, He'd run the place for almost 40 years because he'd opened it very, very young with a couple of friends. Then he took it over to run by himself. And I think he just decided that it was beginning to be too much of a hassle. So the last time I went back, he was selling off some of the records. Not all. He was keeping most of them, but he was selling off a couple boxes. And sadly, just one more listening cafe bites the dust. I don't know what he did with the speakers. I heard a rumor that somebody bought it, but I couldn't confirm that. I would imagine one of his customers would have bought those, though.
Yeah, I mean, really setting out the stall there. In one of the photographs, you can see the one that I took of the exterior looking in. Not only is there a couple of old boys in there with their ties off having a coffee, but very prominently displayed there is the magazine For Men. And just below that in kanji there it says men's coffee. So if you were in any doubt of how perhaps unwelcoming some of these places might seem, certainly to women or to female customers, they may not necessarily be so, but certainly if you were to approach that doorway, you might think twice if you were a potential female customer. I think that the photograph of the sort of shrine-like speakers, again, for me, is one that just always bears kind of a second look, and it has featured in a couple of exhibitions that we've done. But I just think you have this very odd sort of avant-garde kind of cat painting in the middle with this quite sort of realistic looking cat sort of nestled in the middle, and then this sort of cubist body around it, and then you've got kind of permanent ikebana on either side, like just a couple of random flowers, not fresh, of course, just sticking out these tiny little vases. And then you've got the 2 Miles Davis albums. You've got a carriage clock that looks like the kind of thing that people used to be given when they retired from a factory after 50 years in the UK. And then, on the right-hand side, you've got this picture, and it seems almost like it's the kind of photograph that perhaps he either took or someone that he knows took in America. It says there Route 66, and I think 16th or East 16th Street. So a real mishmash of imagery, of sort of iconography, and again, very reminiscent of a shrine. If you go to any kind of shrine, you see this kind of centerpiece, and then around it you'll find different drinks or little snacks or memorials to people or messages and all these kind of things. And this really is essentially the jazz version of it. And I love it. I absolutely love it. I forgot to mention the sort of pink and gold sprayed Christmas tree ready for the December 25th.
This picture, and it's great that that this has gotten noticed in the exhibitions that we were able to share, because this picture sort of gives you everything about what these cafes are being in Japan, like this sort of shrine, this attention to detail. Obviously you mentioned the ikebana, the Japanese flower arrangement, but also the Western influence, not just the jazz albums, but the Route 66, that's the kind of picture you often see in jazz or any music bars or cafes in Japan, where the owners have a particular sort of fetish for Americana. And, obviously what could be more Americana than the song Route 66 and the highway, right? So you've got that, and then you've got the JBL speakers. And of course, we've mentioned how many shops are named after Miles or Monk or Duke or Bird. So your jazz giant legend prominently displayed. It was just a fantastic thing to look at. The cats, I gotta say, I don't dig the Cubist cat though. I don't like him.
Not your thing.
No, I don't like cats in general. And that one looks a little too freaky for me. Yeah,
fair enough. Well, look, that was Milestone again. Sadly, gone, and I suspect, probably judging by that building, that it's more than likely the building itself may have been knocked down and something rebuilt in its place. Perhaps if you're ever around that area again, you'll be able to swing past and kind of confirm one way or the other. We're going to finish up then in Kichijoji, I think, which is on that train line sort of going west out of Tokyo past Shimokitazawa. And we've mentioned Kichijoji a couple of times on previous episodes, and I think there's one or two places that we will be visiting in that around that station area in future episodes. But we're going to finish up with the places that have closed, or perhaps maybe we're coming slightly out of that trough now, because Meg, I think, did close. Is that right? And now it's kind of reopened, but in a non-jazz fashion. Is that right? Or a non-jazz sort of iteration of it?
Well, it's a little bit vague. Meg was a very, very important venue. The owner, Terashima-san, well known as a writer, a journalist, and a producer of compilations for over decades. He would put together compilations of Japanese jazz. So a very well-known guy in the scene. Recently, a couple years ago, I think he turned 80, and his health was, making it a little difficult for him to go in to run every day. He wasn't really there every day anymore anyways, but I think he finally decided to sort of turn over the shop. And now what's really interesting is that they kept the name Meg, but they changed around the concept of the place. They cleaned it up a little bit. It's no longer playing only jazz, and it advertises itself as an audio room, which is, again, that's not a term. I think it's Music Audio Cafe, actually, in English is how they advertise themselves. And obviously sort of moving away from the jazz kisaten brand or, genre, which is probably not a bad idea, really, because as we talked about, a lot of younger people are maybe intimidated by these places, or they just don't want to listen to only jazz for 3 hours. So Meg is sort of cleaned up a bit, turned the focus from just jazz to more of the audio, and is now under new management. So I've not been by yet to take any pictures or to talk to them, or to even check, are they still doing any live gigs, because they used to do some live gigs on Saturday and Sunday nights. And it's obviously a pretty small room. You can see the drum. That drum set was just there all the time. There was no storage space. So the drum, the piano, the mics, they were always there under the classic red speakers, which we've talked about before. So yeah, kind of a sad closure, but maybe that's the best that you can hope for sometimes, because like we talked about, there is a need to maybe redo the whole business model of what these kisaten are as their customers get older and stop coming.
Yeah, I mean, what stands out for me with Meg, or what stood out, was just how red it is. I mean, it's just overwhelmingly red,
Yeah,
and those
yeah.
incredible red speakers. I'd never seen anything like that before I went there, and the only other place I can think of that had them was Bird, was it? Jazz Cafe Bird, I think, has
It
one
was
as well.
Bird in Machida.
Bird and Machida, yeah. So,
Yes.
you know, absolutely incredible, but it probably doesn't come across necessarily in terms of scale when you look at the photograph, but you can also see that there's this really enormous paper mache model of Terashima-san sort of sitting in like a meditation pose.
Yeah.
And you can get a little sense of the scale there if you look at it next to the chairs, but
Yes.
it was pretty huge, right? I think it was raised up off the ground on a shelf, and it was an enormous sort of paper mache statue of him. So those are the things that. So visually, I think, you know, Meg was a really interesting place to go to. There was no one in it that day that we went, and even just again for me, just the typography on the sign going up the stairs, and also just the Modern Jazz Meg sign. I mean, I would think it would be very difficult if you asked a designer to design something that's just as analog and sort of era specific as that now, whether you would really get what you're looking for. And it's just, I wonder, in its new iteration, you know, obviously that sign is gone if it's no longer a jazz place, but I wonder, have they kept any of that kind of branding or not? I think also the toilet.
Even the other one, the sign on the other side of the steps is in Japanese. It says
the
Meg
one going up the stairs.
Yeah, and it says Jazz Kikumise, a shop to listen to jazz.
Yeah.
It's back of the second floor. But Philip, do you remember what was next door to Meg?
There was a classical music,
Yes, that's right.
classical
That's right.
Kisa.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Classic
Kisa.
It was a classical music cafe and
Yeah.
an old school one, because this was one of those old Showa buildings with the the steps that are outdoors and take you up to the second floor, and that classical music cafe was so old school. They had a big, really sternly worded sign on it talking about, like, you are not allowed to talk in here.
That's right.
You know, so that's maybe when we finish the series, we'll get on to our Tokyo Classical Kisaten Joints podcast series.
Oh yeah, it might be a short one. I think that was the closest I got, was the sign of that one outside Meg. In terms of, like, we mentioned bathrooms a lot, which there's probably some Freudian reason for, but you know, I think I felt during the course of the project over those 4 or 5 years, increasingly, you know, maybe it was a difference in the kind of places we were going to, but I suspect that where any kind of renovation that goes on in these places, if it ever takes place, it tends to be the bathroom. You know, at least have a clean toilet, at least have a clean bathroom. And I think Meg's bathroom, again, was one of those great places that had been completely untouched. You know, you've got all this fabulous graffiti in Japanese and English, people signing their names. You've even got a message that I noticed from Smiles, which we also went to, and you can find on tokyojazzjoints.com. So obviously the owner of Smiles has been there. He's signed his name on the toilet wall. And you can see, you know, people love Meg. Perfectly acceptable there to sign your name, leave your mark and so on in a more permanent way. And yeah, I mean, just fabulous. And again, I'm sure now, of course, that's probably gone. And yeah, it tends to be less of a thing more and more now, I think, as we see more and more of these places, you know, this kind of old decrepit bathroom, which, you know, often tells its own story and has its own history. And it's a shame to see them go. And Meg's a beautiful example of that record of customers over the years, you know.
I've got a visit planned to Kichijoji in 2 weeks, so stand by.
Did you say Kichijoji?
Kichijoji.
I think you said Kichijoji.
I did not.
You did. I'm going to cut and send that clip to you back.
Absolutely did not.
Kichijoji.
Total nonsense. Kichijoji.
Well, I know it's Kichi, but I'm sure you said Kichijoji. How strong's that Mucho Aloha? Or whatever it is.
Not that strong at all. It's 5.2. It's not like the Imperial that I was drinking a couple of weeks ago where things got messy.
Fair enough. Okay, so that was Meg. So closed but not closed, but perhaps closed to us, certainly in terms of it no longer really being a jazz kisa as we know it. And fabulous that we got to photograph it and visit it while it still was a kind of a pure, if you like. That's a bit of a loaded word, but certainly, it was a genuine jazz kisa as we know it. And so to finish up, it's really hard. Again, we talked a lot about Basie over the last couple of weeks, and I suppose if it was still going, probably it would be up there just in terms of the reverence and how it's spoken about. And the final place that we're going to talk about, which is a really complicated one to talk about it because we never visited it together. We have visited it individually, but probably before we knew each other. And it has actually been closed now for quite a few years, but certainly there's always reminders of it because I know I lived in Shimokitazawa for many years and I remember where it was and I remember how that area has changed where it used to be. And also, of course, when we've gone to lots of other places around the country, we've often run across either a business card or a book of matches from the one and only Masako. What can we say about Masako?
Oh, I mean, unquestionably one of the most beautiful, most important, most highly regarded jazz kisuten in the whole country.
Yeah.
You're totally right. I mean, we've seen the matchbooks for Masako in places from Hokkaido down to Kyushu.
Yeah.
You've talked to people who knew her. Masako was the owner. She ran it until her death. I believe she died in the early 90s, so it was before you and I came to Japan. But if it had been open now, it would be the oldest place continuously running in the whole Kanto area, the whole Tokyo metro area, since Chigusa moved. So it was open in 52. Masako was one of those owners who was sort of, it's interesting because, we've talked, I think, a little bit. Shimokitazawa is an area that in the 1960s was well known as being sort of a hub of like the hippies, a lot of avant-garde theaters, obviously some jazz joints, So she knew a lot of musicians. And I remember the first time I walked in to Masako, I was just like, I think my knees almost buckled because a gigantic portrait of her and Mal Waldron, this beautiful oil painting. And I just couldn't believe it because I'm a huge Mal Waldron fan. And she was very, very close friends with Mal. He used to come to Japan often and would always go and hang out at Masako. Philip, imagine you were just there as a customer and you walk in and there's Mal Waldron just having a coffee before his gig.
I'll be honest, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, after some of the stories that we've come across and the things that we've discovered on this journey, but yeah, I mean, it was just an incredible place. It was quite large by sort of jazz kisa standards. Amazing sound system, obviously. Very close to the station. Lots of like really sort of comfortable, kind of cozy furnishings, and lots of like little nooks and sort of snugs around it. It was very much like
it kind of felt like an old Japanese house. Where you could imagine the sort of shoji doors closing off a corner, so you could have a little bit of privacy. I mean, I used to, because when I was in college in Japan in 2003 and 2004. I used to live along that train line, a few stops after Shimokita. So I would stop by there all the time and just, by myself just to have a beer and while away a couple of hours. And you never felt that you were intruding on other customers or that they were intruding on you because it had that sort of space to it. Very unique.
Yeah, it was an amazing place. I think I was only in it once or twice, tragically. And then before you knew it, it was gone. And again, if you're familiar with Tokyo and particularly Shimokitazawa, it appeared a few years ago on Vogue's sort of top 10 funkiest neighborhoods in the world or something like that. And it's gone from being, and we mentioned this previously, it's gone from being quite a bohemian sort of hipster in the original sense of the word area. A lot of families as well. A lot of, there's a punk scene there. There was a sort of an off Broadway theater scene. And really, it's just become a kind of a tourist mecca now. And one of the victims, I suppose, or is victim the word? Yeah, one of the sort of victims of that has been, the station area in particular. And it very famously had this kind of cute little sort of village-like station area. It's very sort of cute, very twee. And there was this desire by developers to build very like a huge style station that you see all over Japan, filled with department stores and chain shops and that kind of stuff. And unfortunately, Masako was one of the first places to go as they pushed to kind of redevelop the area around the station and start buying up land. And probably the fact that it was so close to the station was what kind of ultimately endangered it and saw it close. Do we know exactly when it closed?
It closed in 2009, so
right,
it was still open for quite a few years after Masako herself had passed away. And breaking news.
What was the story with the monkey?
Or the monkey?
There was some. So I think, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong here, if anyone else who was in Masako, but I know certainly that on the logo, there was some kind of primate or monkey. And if I'm not mistaken, the owner had, as a pet, some kind of monkey that she would walk around the Shimokitazawa area on a lead.
Okay. I've heard that story, but I've also heard that was nonsense.
Oh, okay.
So but listen,
fake news before fake news. There you go.
Well, no, but would it surprise you if there was a lady of that age in Shimokitazawa when it was still very bohemian who did have a monkey and walked around the streets with it, knowing that how people take their pets here very seriously?
Absolutely not, because there's a man who regularly would walk a Shetland pony up and down Chazawa Dori. There was a man who used to sit with ferrets at a cafe.
More breaking news. More breaking news. As we talked, I've just looked it up. Jazz Kiseten Masako monkey, and there is a lovely picture of her with the monkey inside the Jazz Cafe. Fantastic. So now that doesn't mean she was walking it around the streets, right? But if you can, and maybe we'll put this up on our social media. We'll put the Japanese Masako Jazz Kisaten so you can Google it. And hit the images, and you'll see some great pictures of the interior, the exterior of what it looked like at Shimokitazawa. And also, you can see the oil painting that I mentioned of her with Mal Waldron. So there are some good, a little bit grainy, but some good pictures online of the old Masako.
Well, James, we promised we'd finish on a high note, or at least a positive note. There's not many high notes in our podcast, let's be honest, but let's finish on a positive note. So what is this breaking news? Go and tell us.
Very happy breaking news. Masako, unbelievably, after 10 years, reopened, but in a new location in Shimokitazawa, the other side of the station. Not nearly as big as the original spot, but I went there last night, and a lot of amazing things came together. The woman who runs the new Masako used to work in the old one. 15 to 20 years ago. So very likely she would have served me a couple of beers on one of my numerous visits. Her name is Moeko-san. And Moeko-san is also a member of the group, the Minyo Crusaders, who are now quite a well-known world music group here in Japan. They mix Japanese traditional folk songs with cumbia and Latin rhythms. I know the band, but I did not know Moeko-san was running the new Masako. So it was quite a shock to find out those two worlds coming together. So I went down last night. It's now in a much smaller space on the second floor of a building, just a couple minutes from the east exit. But she was able to keep almost the entire record collection when the original place closed. She was able to keep some of the great paintings and decor that was in the old Masako. Unfortunately, the Mal Waldron painting is somewhere else up in Hakodate at the moment. Now, because it was crowded last night, I couldn't get a lot of time to talk with her. She's the only one that works there. She runs the new place herself. But she's even kept the Masako coffee mugs, which, again, if you look up some of the pictures, you'll see the katakana script. So she's even got some of those. And she's got the fantastic record collection. Check out my Instagram feed, Mr. OK Jazz Tokyo. You'll see the picture I took last night of the menu and this wall of records. So, I was really thrilled. And what was really interesting was, as I did talk with her just for a couple minutes, all of a sudden, two young women came in who are friends of hers, both of whom are musicians, one of whom runs their own label. And they said that a lot of the old Kisuten style, like we wouldn't come because we want to talk to each other and sometimes get a bit noisy hanging out. But now, it's not a problem to do that, because the owner is fine with it. So she's sort of created a space that's a mixture of the old classic style. You've got the records, the decor, and she's playing full on jazz. I mean, she was playing Joe Henderson and Alice Coltrane last night when I was there. But also allowing customers to come in and have a good time on a Friday night and not be shushed for making noise.
Awesome.
So it's just really great news to know that this kind of place can still open and bring in new customers, and maybe there is some hope that they won't all disappear.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, I think for me, I just love the fact that they've and again, just to reference what we were talking about earlier about this idea of protecting and preserving this kind of culture, and to see that continuity that's been carried on with the logo and the name and just even the record collection and the people who worked in it and stuff. It's just so fantastic to hear that it's open again. And if I needed any more incentives to go to Japan as soon as possible, I think I just found that this could be the straw that broke the camel's back, I think.
Well, Philip, as soon as you do get back, because now we've got 3 spots in Shimokita to add to our list. We've got Moscow, we've got Hayashi, and we've got no room for squares. So already our first night will be planned out.
Awesome. Can't wait. I'll just get on the Aer Lingus website right now once I'm off here. Also, if they want to sponsor the podcast, please do get in touch.
They can sponsor your half of the podcast. I'll have Guinness sponsor my half.
I'm a pretty easy customer. I'm not fussy. I'll fly economy. Listen, James, that was a long one this week, but I think it's worth doing a good number on these ones that are closed in particular, because as I've said several times, it really was the original raison d'etre for the project, and it's spun out in different directions since we began it 5 or 6 years ago. When we talk about somewhere like Masako, I mean, happily it's reopened. Of course, it's not the same. Of course, it'll never quite be the same. But the fact that we've been able to preserve, over 130 of these places already, regardless of what happens to them in what could be a potentially difficult future for many of these places, is a real privilege. And I'm so happy that we've been able to do it. If you've jumped straight into this podcast at episode 29, I'm talking directly to you. Please go to tokyojazzjoints.com. Check out the photographs. If you want to follow us on social media, at Tokyo Jazz Joints, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you are listening to podcasts regularly, please, please, please pop on there and give us a rating and a review. It will really help increase our listenership and really help get the podcast out to a wider audience. Takes about 2 minutes. James can check the ones on the Apple Store Japan. I can check the ones on the Apple Store UK and Ireland. And please, please do give us a review if you like it. If jazz cafes or 2 old blokes just talking about their travels around Japan is not your thing, don't slag it off. Just go and listen to something else.
Words of wisdom, my friend. Words of wisdom. Go and listen to my other podcast, OK Jazz, and check out KOL Radio on Mixcloud.com. You hear a lot of great contributors from around the world, including a very special spiritual jazz mix from ye olde Dublin town.
Yes. And on that note, James, peace be with you, brother.
See you next week, buddy.
Take it easy.